everybody. We're here today with Jonathan Lowy. Jonathan is the president and founder of Global Action on Gun Violence. He has litigated and won trailblazing, impactful lawsuits and advocated against gun violence for 25 years. More recently, he was one of the lawyers in the case by Mexico against U.S. gun dealers and manufacturers. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court last summer. Jonathan is here to give us an update and on the ongoing issue of gun trafficking itself. Welcome, Jonathan. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
The case, remember, it started several years ago, and I thought it was really fascinating and ambitious. How did you get involved in that case?
Sure. And first, there are two lawsuits that Mexico has brought. I'm in my organization, Global Action on Gun Violence, are co-counsel in both of those. But I'll talk about the first case, which was against manufacturers. And you know, there's been a problem for decades where Mexico has very strong gun laws. They actually have a constitutional right to bear arms, one of the few countries in the world, like the United States, that does, but they have very strong laws that prevent criminals from getting guns. They don't manufacture guns. When the lawsuit was initiated, they had one gun store in the entire country, and that was on an army base. So very difficult to get guns. They now have two gun stores in the country. So, you know, they're the sort of country that, like other countries in the world, should not have much of a gun violence problem. However, Mexico has one of the worst gun violence problems in the world. And you know, the drug cartels, as we all know about, you know, do a tremendous amount of damage both in Mexico and also in the United States and other parts of the world. And their life's blood is their firepower, their guns. And so that problem, that gun violence problem, results almost entirely from the United States, from the United States gun industry, enabled by weak U.S. gun laws. About somewhere between 80 to 90% of the crime guns in Mexico, used by criminals in Mexico, are illegally trafficked from the United States. You know, if Mexico wasn't bordering us, they wouldn't have this problem.
80 to 90%. And
yeah, it's
military grade, aren't they? It's more than just handguns we're talking about.
There's a lot of assault rifles. There are belt-fed guns, military set guns. There's 50 caliber sniper rifles is one type of gun that the cartels use. These are guns that can shoot helicopters out of the sky. They can shoot through the fuselage of an airplane. They can go through reinforced concrete. They have a range of about a mile. They're true military weapons. In the United States, if you're 18 years old and can pass a minimal background check, you can buy one or all you want. And you know, that to me has been in this issue for almost 30 years now. You know, that continues to amaze me that we allow that. And while fortunately that's not been a massive problem in the United States, it is a big problem in Mexico. The cartels use these weapons. They've used them to battle the military, and they've used them to shoot Mexican military helicopters out of the sky. And so it's important to understand how this crime gun pipeline happens, because it happens as a result of conscious, deliberate practices by the U.S. gun industry, or specifically by bad actors in the U.S. gun industry. I mean, what happens is, for one, Most gun dealers in the United States are responsible business people. They care about their sales practices. They care about public safety. They go the extra mile to prevent their guns from being sold to gun traffickers and straw buyers and criminals. And as a result, going back 25 years or so, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms data has shown that about 80-90% of gun dealers sell zero crime guns. So perfect record. No, not a problem at all. Even though they're, selling guns that are sought after by criminals. The problem is you've got a small percentage of gun dealers who are really bad actors. Like in every profession, there's a small percentage that are bad actors, but when you're in the gun business, they can do a tremendous amount of harm. And what those gun dealers do is when they're faced with a obvious gun trafficker who any reasonable gun dealer knows this person is not buying the guns for themselves, they're happy to sell those guns. And when I say obvious gun trafficker, you see people who will go into a gun store. Well, maybe they'll buy 5, maybe 10. I had a case where someone bought 85 guns in a single purchase. They'll pay all in cash. Maybe they'll come in the store with somebody else. They'll come back a few weeks later, buy more guns, more ammunition. These are buying patterns that just aren't normal. And, the 90% of good guys who are selling guns, they'd ask the right questions. They'd say, why are you buying these guns? If they don't get really good answers, they send them out the door. Maybe they call ATF or other law enforcement. But these bad actors, that's the problem. And manufacturers, for their part, know. And they've been told by ATF, they've been told by the Justice Department that this is how your guns, Mr. Manufacturer, are getting into the criminal market. It's through these bad actors who are engaging in these reckless, if not illegal, sales practices. Manufacturers, you should take care that your dealers that you're using downstream are well trained, responsible, and law abiding. And Justice Department has told manufacturers that, and they have done the opposite. I mean, they've just imposed no standards, no conditions, no training. In fact, many manufacturers will tell you that if a dealer is indicted for violating the law, as long as they keep their license, manufacturer has no problem supplying them all the guns they want to sell, even if they know that they're violating the law. So Mexico brought this lawsuit, and I work with them to bring this, making the argument that what manufacturers are doing in knowingly supplying these bad acting gun dealers is negligent. It is something that under the civil justice system isn't allowed, and you should be held accountable for the harm you're causing.
What I remember about the case, and correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there one in Massachusetts and then another one out west? Was it maybe Arizona? It was very detailed in the description, and it really showed not only what was being manufactured, military grade type of weapons, and that was part of the arguments in the lawsuit too, the idea that the manufacturers knew that what they were producing was at such a kind of an irresponsible level, and then 2, that it was being trafficked to not just Mexico, but and I don't think this was part of the case, but there is another level. I mean, just they were then also going down to Central America. And what I what I like about the case is it brought attention to what was going on, because I think this is an issue. I don't think many people really realize this. And when people hear talk about Mexico or talk about migration, it's very kind of narrowly focused. And this kind of opened up a new avenue in that topic, because it got into your lawsuit did was it got into how difficult it is for the government to have a kind of a responsible nation. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know that the lawsuit was very detailed in how it was destabilizing the situation there. And then when you mention the negligence, is it mainly, what's the motivation? Is it mainly profit?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, the manufacturers, unfortunately, some of the manufacturers, the ones that Mexico sued, put profit ahead of everything. I mean, and the fact is that, uh, you know, manufacturers and dealers, um, you know, make money from the criminal market. I mean, that's just a fact. If dealer sells 10, 20, 50 guns, to a obvious gun trafficker, that's the same profit that that they're getting, that they would get from a law-abiding gun owner or police department or something like that. Same with the manufacturer. It's profit. Now, they should be putting public safety and their obligations to prevent supplying criminal market ahead of that. And again, 90% of gun dealers do. I mean, and they deserve tremendous credit. I mean, they're, letting profits walk out the door because they put public safety first. But you got this small percentage of bad actors that aren't doing that. And then you've got manufacturers who are choosing to profit. It would be very easy for manufacturers to just have standards for dealers and cut off supply to these bad actors. And by the way, going back 20, 25 years, 30 years, there were voices in the gun industry, not people like me, but people who are in the business of selling guns and representing gun companies that were the leading voices saying, this is a big problem. We as an industry should keep our house in order. We should have standards for the dealers who are selling our guns, and the ones that are the problem, that are supplying so many crime guns, they shouldn't be supplied. Manufacturers should cut them off. And you had voices at every level of the gun industry, vocally making those sorts of arguments. And unfortunately, they were ignored, they were silenced. In some cases, they were ostracized for speaking up. And then what happened is that in 2005, the gun industry lobbied successfully to Congress for enactment of a what's called the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, which I'll call PLCAA. And that was a law to protect gun companies from civil liability in many cases. It's in my view, a totally un-American, outrageous law, because what it does is it makes two systems of justice in this country. And there's one, if you or I, in fact, if you or I negligently sell a gun, assuming you're not a licensed gun dealer, I assume you're not, I'm not, we can be sued for if that gun is, if we're negligent and the gun is then used in a crime, we can be sued. However, if you're a licensed gun dealer or gun manufacturer and you do that same negligent act 25 times a day, you get special protection. from this law. And what the law also does is it makes victims of gun industry negligence into second-class citizens. Where if you're injured by a negligently sold or negligently designed BB gun or tuna
Hmm.
fish sandwich or bunk bed, name your product, you have a right to bring a lawsuit. You don't have a right to win, but if you can make the facts and the law in your favor, then you win and you can recover damages. However, if you have exactly those same facts with a deadly firearm sold by a licensed manufacturer or dealer, in many cases, you cannot bring that case, or your case is dismissed. And that ultimately is what happened with Mexico's case. Mexico's case against manufacturers was extraordinarily well supported by the facts. I mean, you can
Hmm.
file a lawsuit with a few pages and not much detail. That's generally allowed. Mexico filed something like 130-page complaint with detailed evidence supporting
Wow.
the case. I think really any right-minded person reads that complaint and they'd say, this is wrong what those manufacturers are doing. They just, they should be selling guns the right way. Not that
Hmm.
they should stop selling guns, but they should just sell them the right way, sell them carefully. And there's really no good reason they have not to do that other than they want to make money, even if it comes from, supplying the cartels. But because of the special protection law PLCAA, what ultimately happened, we had a victory in the appellate court, and then the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately said that special law PLCAA creates a much, much higher standard of liability for manufacturers, and Mexico did not meet that standard. So ultimately, that
Oh.
ended that case. As you mentioned, there's another case that Mexico has brought, and I'm counsel in that as well, and it says Global Action on Gun Violence.
Is
In
that still
Arizona
active?
against gun dealers. That's still active. So that
Oh.
case against the gun dealers in Arizona is ongoing. It's active. It's in discovery now.
Oh, well, that's very significant. And the that immunity shield, and at the time when the Supreme Court decided on this last summer, you were quoted as saying that the Mexico's lawyers in this case that the ruling by the Supreme Court is the clearest evidence yet that the gun industry's special interest get out of court free card must be revoked. How does that immunity for gun manufacturers and dealers compare to other industries? Because it seems like in this country, everybody can sue any, we have to be so careful, and whether it's journalists or the victims of the Epstein Maxwell case. I mean, everyone has to be so careful about what they say and do. And but here you've got the gun industry is so shielded. But haven't you won on that before? I mean, you've been litigating in this field for some
Yeah, I
time.
mean, there are, first of all, I mean, there is no uh, industry that has anything remotely like the special protection from civil liability that the gun industry has. Um, Nothing.
Mm.
I mean, you cannot find any other industry where their negligence or even recklessness, which is a higher standard, um, can be protected, where they can basically get away with negligently causing harm or recklessly causing harm, and there's absolutely no uh, accountability and no liability and no redress for victims against the manufacturer, distributor, or dealer. You just can't. There is no parallel to it. Um, that's unfortunately true in a number of ways for the gun industry. I mean, guns are the only consumer product that are exempt from federal product safety oversight. Consumer Product Safety Commission regulates the safety of every other consumer product in America. other than some things like automobiles where their safety is regulated by a different agency. But firearms is the only one where they can fail to put in safety features, which are easily feasible, life-saving, inexpensive, and there are a number of them. I've represented families where children have been killed because the lack of feasible safety features.
Mhm.
Federal government, if it was any other product, including a BB gun, federal government could say, you have to put in these safety features. Guns, they can't. And there are a number of other
Oh.
areas where the gun industry has this special protection because of their political uh, clout.
And I remember when that law was passed in 2005, are there efforts to reform that law? I mean, obviously it went too far. You're saying there's a lack of regulatory um, regulation over it, and then this immunity shield. Is that is that part of the reason there's some bad actors? I mean, is that related to the idea of you said, I think 80-90% are responsible, and you're not arguing against the constitutional right to own guns. And I think some people hear anything about guns and they automatically, react and assume that that's what you're doing. But that's not what you're saying. You're arguing for responsible and being accountable. But is that why are there bad actors?
Well, I mean, there have been these bad actors for a long time. So certainly before this special protection law was enacted. So I mean, what happened was because there was this longstanding problem of the 5% or so of dealers selling all the crime guns and the manufacturers willingly using those bad acting dealers, there were a number of lawsuits against the gun industry going back into the 1990s. I was involved in a lot of these cases. And actually, what happened was, as a result of some of these suits, there was a settlement back in 2000 with Smith & Wesson, major gun manufacturer, where Smith & Wesson agreed to reform its business practices. And it agreed to do a lot of things that Mexico was asking it to do. It agreed to have standards for its gun dealers and only sell through authorized, responsible dealers. Unfortunately, what then happened was two things. One, there was a sort of industry boycott of Smith & Wesson to punish it for doing the right thing.
Wow.
It almost drove Smith & Wesson into bankruptcy. And then Smith & Wesson walked away from the agreement and refused to follow it. And then the rest of the gun industry, instead of getting the message and saying, let's start acting responsibly or let's settle cases against us, they did the opposite. They went to Congress and said, give us protection from suit so we can keep on supplying the criminal market and not have accountability. That's what led to PLCAA, the special protection law. But there are exceptions to PLCAA. You can bring some lawsuits. I mean, I mentioned the case that against the gun dealers that it is permitted under an exception to PLCAA. There's also cases manufacturers that I and others have been involved in that go through those exceptions, which are allowed. So it doesn't eliminate liability, but it does prevent and prohibit a number of just good, solid, legally based lawsuits like Mexico's, and that's outrageous. So one thing that can happen is PLCAA should be repealed. There have been efforts to try to repeal it. I believe that's also unconstitutional, and I've been arguing that in courts, and there was an intermediate appellate court in Pennsylvania that agreed that it was unconstitutional violation of the 10th Amendment and exceeding Congress's Commerce Clause authority. That was then reversed by the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. But I do believe that is an argument that other courts will accept, and that there is a chance that PLCAA ultimately will be struck down as unconstitutional.
What about people who may just be learning about some of these issues, the legal side of this? What can somebody who might be watching, what would you recommend they do to get involved?
I mean, there are a lot of organizations doing good work. I mean, I certainly first thing I suggest is get engaged. Go to our website, actiononguns.org. And again, we're Global Action on Gun Violence. If you Google us, you will get it as well. And so you can check us out, learn more. You can sign up for updates. And I think that's the first step, is to get informed, get engaged, and then there's action steps you can take. There's a lot of other work that we're doing. I mean, one of our focuses is the international space. I spent 25 years doing domestic gun violence prevention litigation and other work, and then left to create and found Global Action on Gun Violence, because I felt that there's that the U.S. gun policy is as bad as it is in the United States. It is a bigger problem than that, because U.S. gun policy is driving crime in Mexico and in Jamaica and in Haiti and in Canada and in other parts of Central America, and even going down to South America. All these countries, you have many of them, you have 80-90% of their crime guns are being trafficked from the United States. It's a consequence of U.S. gun industry practices and U.S. policies. And so, that's a problem that has to be dealt with for those countries. It also comes back to bite us in the United States. I mean, the arming of the cartels in Mexico that's what empowers them to traffic fentanyl into communities in the United States. It's violence in Mexico that spurs migration across the border. So if you care about migration, if you care about fentanyl overdoses and trafficking, if you care about human trafficking, if you care about the spread of organized crime in the United States, all of this is driven by the U.S. gun industry's supply of the crime gun pipeline. And again, this is happening throughout the region. But I also think that pressure from other countries and from the international community and from people who may not have been on the side of gun industry reform, if you just looked at it as a gun issue, but they do want to stop the cartels from being armed. They do want to stop these problems that are coming from the cartels. Those are all new pressures that I think is a really important part of the solution to the gun violence problem here in the U.S.
It's a really important topic, and I'm really glad to learn about it. It seems like a topic and an issue that can actually unite people. I mean, it's common sense. Like, why would you want to allow them arming cartels with such military grade weapons? And it, like you say, it comes back to bite us. I think it's a really important topic. It's worth taking the time to learn about. And I thank you very much. We'll stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patty, and happy to talk to you again about any of these other issues or developments.